Peter Adamson, and you're listening to the History of Philosophy podcast, brought to you with the support of the Philosophy Department at King's College London and the LMU in Munich. Online at historyofphilosophy.net. Today's episode, Comedy of Errors, Molière. The relevance of Molière to philosophy is usually reduced to a single scene in his play, The Imaginary Invalid. To be fair, it's a pretty great scene. It sends up the scholastically trained doctors by depicting an examination of expertise in medicine. When the candidate is asked to explain the sleep-inducing effect of opium, he confidently replies that it is because opium has a dormitive power, that is, a power to induce sleep. This empty triviality is acclaimed by the examiners as a perfect answer. Molière's characteristically incisive bit of mockery has become a standard reference point in philosophy. Still today, one need only say dormitive power to evoke the problem of circular or uninformative explanations, something that philosophers often find themselves accused of offering. It's such a familiar example, in fact, that I couldn't resist mentioning it myself about 100 episodes back when I was talking about French medicine and Jean Fernet's defense of Aristotelian powers as crucial for science. In the longer run, it's the playwright Molière and not the royal physician Fernet who has been vindicated, but by itself that wouldn't warrant devoting a whole installment of this series to his comedies. What does warrant it is the powerful resonance between those comedies and the last topic we tackled, French moralism. Though Molière is not usually thought of as a moralist in his own right, he is sometimes discussed together with them, and for good reason, because he put on stage many of the same human frailties that a moralist like La Rochefoucauld was exploring in his maxims. Admittedly, La Rochefoucauld did this in the form of barbed ironic aphorisms, whereas Molière's specialty was outrageous farce. While both authors scandalized their contemporaries, La Rochefoucauld was accused of cynicism, whereas Molière's plays were simply condemned as obscene. Still, both men were labeled as libertines by their enemies, as when a pamphlet described Molière as a demon clothed in flesh and dressed as a man, the most outstandingly impious libertine who has ever lived. And if we look beyond La Rochefoucauld to less famous moralists, we'll find an even closer parallel to Molière in the form of Jean de la Bruyère. Like La Rochefoucauld, he reacted critically to earlier moralistic writers who had upheld the ideal of aristocratic virtue called honnêteté, revealing this ideal as a facade put on out of self-interest. It's been written that he portrays a superficial society, one without moral values, where life has become a routine of purposeless, mechanical repetitions. La Bruyère is best known for his work Characters, published in 1688 with 7 more editions following. It is built around maxims, like the work of La Rochefoucauld, but as the title suggests, also describes various defective personality types, the better to help us predict how people will behave out of their wicked motives. Here's how awful rich people can be. Here's how awful witty people are. Here's how awful people are in the city or at court. And don't even get him started on the priesthood, or for that matter, the impious freethinkers. One could almost read it as a compilation of suggestions for figures to be included in a satirical comedy by Molière. Unlike La Rochefoucauld, though, La Bruyère seems openly optimistic about the possibility of genuine virtue, as when he says that true peace and courage in the face of death stem from virtue, advantages denied to the hypocrite. In this respect, at least, Molière is more comparable to the consistently pessimistic La Rochefoucauld. But then putting saints on stage is hardly a way to get laughs, and getting laughs was Molière's primary aim. As he says in the preface to one of his most famous plays, Tartuffe, comedy is one thing and theology quite another. Tartuffe is in fact the great comedic portrayal of a type we can read about in La Bruyère, the religious hypocrite. The title character has wormed his way into the affections of a man named Orgon. Tartuffe is a monster of greed and lust who has convinced Orgon that he is a paragon of temperance and piety. His teaching includes recognizably philosophical tenets. Thus, Orgon says that Tartuffe has helped him learn to reject all that he used to value, to the point that he now could watch his family die without being distressed. That's a clear reference to the demanding ethic of Stoicism, which would have it that only virtue is valuable and everything else indifferent, even the lives of one's loved ones. Of course, Tartuffe is in truth no Stoic sage, but he knows the value of persuading his victims otherwise. His tactic is to exploit the contrast between outer appearance and inner wickedness That was La Rochefoucauld's main theme. As Tartuffe gleefully says, "There's no evil till the act is known, it's scandal which makes it an offense, and it's no sin to sin in confidence." One might think that no one could object to the unmasking of those who use religion to hide their sins, but one would be wrong. The play turned out to be immensely controversial. It was shown in its original first version, now lost, at Versailles, with the king pronouncing it very entertaining. But a group of devouts, the so-called Company of the Holy Sacrament, got the play banned. Molière reworked it twice, and was finally able to put it on again in 1669. As far as Molière was concerned, the critics were implicitly admitting that they were just like Tartuffe. Otherwise, why would they be offended? He defended the play by saying that the hypocrites could not take mockery, adding a remark worthy of La Rochefoucauld, "We are willing to be wicked, but we will not be ridiculous." Of course, the accusation was that he was really mocking the very idea of being pious and taking religion seriously, but he countered this, quite plausibly, by saying that the hypocrisy of Tartuffe is abundantly evident. There are no shades or subtleties of motivation here, rather the character displays only the essential traits that make immediately manifest a true out-and-out hypocrite. Molière's defense implies that he was not just trying to get laughs with Tartuffe, but also impart a moral lesson. Or rather, Molière doesn't just imply this, he says outright that the mission of comedy is to correct men's vices. For this exalted conception of comedy, he invokes the authority of the ancient philosophers, who, according to him at least, had a high opinion of comedy. By the way, supposedly Molière excelled at philosophy in his youthful studies at the Collège de Clermont, where, according to legend, he sat at the feet of Pierre Gassendi, along with famous fellow students like Cyrano de Bergerac. But despite his training in logic, he wasn't above engaging in the occasional inconsistency. Sometimes he makes these high moral claims for comedy, and sometimes he says that the measure of a good comedy is simply whether it makes people laugh. This is the yardstick proposed for measuring comedies in another work of Molière, which displays another of his characteristic traits, a penchant for meta-level commentary on his own plays. His comedy, The School for Wives, staged in 1666, provoked widespread outrage for its suggestive sexual humor. Molière responded by putting on a play called The School for Wives Criticized, in which a group of characters sit around arguing about whether the previous play was any good. Molière often acted in his own comedies, and here he took the role of a relentless critic who deems The School for Wives the worst play ever written. There's a good deal of self-reflexive fun to be had here, as when one of the critics complains that Molière has offended against the ancient strictures on good dramatic structure by having his comedy consist of nothing but conversation with no action, something that applies even more to the play we're now watching. The characters also spend the end of the play dithering about the best way to end a play. Along with such playful irony, Molière conveys a defense of his previous work, which consists in an appeal to popularity. For the prudish critics, it seems to be a point against Molière that audiences flock to the theater to see his works. These critics prefer unpopular productions that follow the classical rules, like people who reject a delicious meal on the grounds that the cook hasn't followed a recipe. Their preference for propriety above actual enjoyment shows a misunderstanding of the purpose of the theater, which here is said to be not moral improvement, but the audience's pleasure. Upon further reflection, though, we might realize that Molière's two defensive strategies do fit with one another after all. By pretending to enjoy proper comedy that is actually very dull, the critics too are revealing themselves to be hypocrites. As for the offense they take, this too just shows their own wickedness, given that Molière's style of obscenity is suggestive rather than fully explicit. In one infamous scene from The School for Wives, a sentence is repeatedly uttered that sounds like it might have ended with a reference to the genitalia. No one could miss the joke, but nothing rude is said out loud. Indeed, that's part of the joke. The characters who speak out in defense of their own author thus implausibly suggest that it's not Molière's fault if some have such dirty minds that they fill out all the crude details. Aristocratic women who pretended to be shocked at the play were showing that their ears are more virginal than all the rest of their bodies. Again, this is good fun, and also makes a more serious point about censorship. Works of art are, as one character puts it, like public mirrors. and those who favor banning them are tacitly admitting to share the faults they find in the author. Thus far, then, it seems that we can put Molière alongside the French moralists as an insightful critic of hypocrisy, one who realizes that those who trumpet their own virtue are the most hypocritical of all. This applies to the real-life critics of Molière's comedies, Tartuffe being the ultimate comedic representation of that type of person. In this sense, they were right to be offended because the play really was attacking them. But our assessment of Molière's project is complicated by his other most famous play, The Misanthrope. Here, too, the central character, whose name is Alceste, also represents a certain type. He is a man utterly incapable of hypocrisy. Alceste is like someone who has read La Rochefoucauld's maxims and taken them far too seriously, with the result that he refuses to say anything other than what he sincerely believes. Thus, when he's asked to give his opinion about a man's poetry, he's honest enough to pour scorn on the effort. When the shocked author says that others have expressed admiration for his sonnet, Alceste spits back, yes, because they are hypocrites. A lawsuit follows, which is resolved only when Alceste grudgingly agrees to apologize, not for being spectacularly rude, but for not liking the poem more. In another lawsuit, he stands to lose a huge amount of money unjustly, a result he welcomes because it confirms his bleak views on human nature. Alceste is a fascinating and memorable character and has inspired a variety of interpretive approaches. On one reading, he's a medical type as well as an ethical type, a representation of someone who is suffering from melancholy. There's clear evidence for this in the play, which in its opening scene explicitly ties Alceste's bleak worldview to a melancholic humor. Yet again, this recalls La Rochefoucauld, who, as you may recall, suggests in some of his maxims that our character is dependent on the humors of the body. These moralists reject the optimistic Cartesian notion that the mind can dominate the body and subdue the passions through sufficient will. Elizabeth of Bohemia was already unpersuaded by this, and apparently Molière was too. The distinctive twist is that his character, Alceste, is under the sway of bodily influence, yet absolutely convinced that he is being perfectly rational. He is certainly no hypocrite, but he is just as certainly self-deluded, as if it were not his enslavement to his nature, but rather his free will and honor which prompt him to set an example for society, in the words of one interpreter of the play. Evidently, then, Alceste is not supposed to be a mouthpiece for Molière or a character we are meant to admire. It's been said that the hypocrite is the supreme villain in all Molière's mature plays because he undermines by stealth the social rules which the disaffected still recognize, even in the act of questioning them. But the radical frankness and sincerity of Alceste turns out to degrade the fabric of society no less than the hypocrisy of a Tartuffe. Molière makes that point clear by having the play end with Alceste announcing his intention to withdraw from society entirely. A serious point emerges from reading Tartuffe and the Misanthrope side by side. Yes, it is wrong to be an outright hypocrite, like Tartuffe, but you shouldn't go to extremes in the other direction. To some extent, hypocrisy is justifiable, since it is the oil that makes the gears of society work properly. This is not unlike the Aristotelian idea that virtue lies in the mean between extremes, applied to the theme of sincerity. And Molière's point is well worth considering. It's not just about politeness. As La Rochefoucauld might put it, hypocrisy often leads us to restrain our worst impulses to ensure that people think we are better than we truly are. In support of this reading, I would point to the character Philinte, a friend of Alceste who tries to talk him into a more moderate approach, which as it turns out means accepting a degree of hypocrisy on the part of both others and himself. Philinte is politely complimentary towards the poem that Alceste openly derides, consistently with a point he's made earlier in the play, that one shouldn't always tell the truth, because sometimes the truth is inappropriate. In the final act, Philinte further observes that each human frailty provides occasion for philosophy, meaning that the failures of others give us an opportunity to exercise our own virtue. These tolerant and moderate opinions mark Philinte as an example of another character type who appears in several of Molière's plays, the so-called raisonneur, or reasoner. Other examples include Chrysale in The School for Wives and Cléante in Tartuffe. Chrysale tries to reason with the pathologically jealous Arnulf, who is so paranoid about being betrayed that he deliberately chooses to marry a girl who he thinks will be too stupid to cheat on him. Cléante laments the hypocrisy of Tartuffe, but is also used to insert praise of the truly pious into the play in what might be an attempt to appease critics of the earlier version. Here, it would be tempting to take the reasoners as mouthpieces for Molière. Amidst all the lewd humor and extreme characterization, he uses them to endorse the temperate, enlightened, and untroubled ethical worldview of the honorable man or honnête homme. But this seems out of keeping with Molière's satirical intent, and it's hard to believe that Molière's audience was meant to nod along with Crésal's sage advice that having your wife cheat on you is no big deal, because cuckoldry is what you make of it. This same air of moral detachment is observable in Philinte from The Misanthrope. He tells Alceste that there's no point even judging the moral failings of humans, any more than it would make sense to be enraged by the behavior of vultures, apes, and wolves. The shortcomings of humans, too, are simply natural. In this same scene, Philinte is labeled as being phlegmatic, in contrast to Alceste's melancholic disposition, suggesting that he too is driven not so much by reason as by the mixture of his humors. Where Alceste rages at wickedness, Philinte greets it with no more than a shrug, indulging in a form of moderation that itself becomes extreme, tipping over into a kind of moral skepticism. So, if he and the other reasoners are indeed philosophers, then the philosopher is just another character type Molière puts on stage for the purposes of ridicule. I can't take offense at that, since if this podcast stands for anything, it's for the principle that philosophers should have a sense of humor. And between Molière and the wit of La Rochefoucauld, we've now had plenty of evidence that deep insights can be delivered with a wry smile, or even a guffaw of laughter. But the form of theater we more readily associate with philosophy is not comedy, of course, it's tragedy. In The School of Wives criticized, Molière has one of his characters say that writing good comedies is harder than writing good serious drama. And here, one senses that a character really is, for once, voicing one of the author's sincerely held opinions. But I can think of one contemporary author who would have disagreed with him, Racine, another towering figure of French theater from this period whose specialty was the tragedy. It would be a you-know-what if you failed to join the audience next time as he takes the stage here on The History of Philosophy without any gaps.